This is always a little bit more challenging than I intend for it to be. I always think it's surely the case that pop stars have minions who do this for them. I don't know. "37 words. In Luke's telling, that's how many words there are in the Lord's Prayer, just 37. The disciples had asked Jesus to teach them to pray, and he gave them 37 words and said, "Pray this." I think it's obvious that Jesus did not suppose that his disciples over the course of their lives would only need 37 words in their prayers. I don't think he thinks that about us. They would need these words and many, many, many more. But I do think that he wanted to give them a prayer and a model for all their other prayers. I think that the Lord's Prayer is our most sacred prayer. And I think that the Lord's Prayer is a set of instructions about prayer as well. Think for a minute about its structure. Begin, Jesus says, by acknowledging whom you are talking to, which seems like a very reasonable request. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Notice, as Kayla pointed out 2 weeks ago, the tensions in that statement. God, so much bigger, so beyond you, in heaven, but God who is right next to you, the one whom you call father or mother or friend. I found myself thinking of Paul's beautiful words in his sermon to the Athenians, God, in whom we live and move and have our being, a phrase that captures both the vastness and the intimacy of God. That's the starting point in the instructions. And then, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We ask that God's wishes for the world come to pass before we ask for anything else. And then, the 7 words for today. Give us this day our daily bread. This is the moment when the prayer pivots just a bit. We start with contemplating God and what God wants, and then here we shift to what we want, starting with having our basic needs met. And notice that it's written in the imperative. It doesn't say please, it just says give. That's important, I think. It shows that Jesus was concerned about physical needs as well as spiritual ones, certainly both. But you know, there's more to these 7 words as well. I complained all week to Annie that I had never given a sermon when I had exactly 7 words to work with. But it turns out there is lots to be sort of unpacked from those 7 words. Just about every commentator on this part of the Lord's Prayer suggests that one way to understand this petition is by reference to the story of the manna provided to the Israelites in the wilderness. I think that most of us know this story, at least in outline. The Israelites have been on the escape route out of Egypt for a month, and they are now in a part of the wilderness that is particularly barren. And quite predictably, they complain about the lack of food. I swear to you, if you read all of Exodus, it's like Exodus is taking a group of very small children on a drive all the way to California. There is a lot of complaining that goes on. God willingly, happily provides that food. Flocks of quail come in the evenings and provide them with meat. And every morning, God tells them that they should come out of their tents and gather manna from the ground. And we assume it's a substance from which one could make bread or little cakes. There actually is such a thing as manna. And if we had 2 hours here today, I would go into a lengthy and fairly boring version of how you can buy manna candy in Pakistan. Okay, so far so good. God's message here is clear. God provides for all the people. But there's more to this. A deeper message to this story is embedded in the instructions that God gives about the manna. Every day, each family is to gather what they need for the day. except on Friday, they are to gather twice as much so that they have enough for the Sabbath as well. And from here, it gets really interesting. As I suppose you can imagine, some people gather manna very quickly, some people more slowly. I always picture this poor woman trying to keep track of 5 little kids and trying to gather manna. Some have more, some have less. But when they go to eat it, they find that everyone has enough. Always, always, there is enough. And then, rather predictably, given human inclinations, a few of the Israelites decide to be greedy and decide to be untrusting. The sort of people who are thinking, yeah, well, he gave it today, but I'm not so sure about tomorrow. So these people gather way, way, way more than enough, and they decide to store it, hide it away. And what they find the next morning is that all their excess has rotted. It's full of maggots. The message? I think it's pretty clear. Enough for everyone is God's instructions. More than enough for any individual is too much. And what does this have to do with give us our daily bread? Well, the answer is hidden in plain sight. Notice that it does not say, give me this day my daily bread. It says, give us our daily bread. In fact, it is the case the Lord's Prayer never, ever uses the words I or my, just we, us, your, speaking of God. Now, I want to be careful here. I titled this sermon, I think the word I'm looking for is stupidly. It should read, there's no I in the Lord's Prayer, not in prayer in general. And actually, I think that's a pretty lousy title. So please lose your bulletins afterwards. I want no record of this. All right. Can there be an I in other prayers? Well, of course there can. Absolutely. Just look at Jesus's ministry and all the people who came to him with personal requests. The man who asked to be healed from blindness, the centurion who asked Jesus to heal his daughter, the woman who touched the hem of his robe because she couldn't bring herself to say her plea for healing out loud. And to each, Jesus responded with love and compassion and healing. Just a few verses later in Luke 11, in case we're confused about it, Jesus tells his disciples to ask. Ask, and it shall be given to you. I do think that in this prayer, the model for all other prayers, Jesus reminds us that we are first and foremost part of a community. Even as we ask for our individual needs to be met, we dare not forget those whose needs are not met because of the way the world is organized. The story of manna should teach us this: there is enough for everyone. God saw to it. So if thousands upon thousands of people just in our own country go without their basic human needs being met, then we need to be clear here. This is not God's will. The Lord's Prayer has us pray for God's kingdom to come. Give us this day our daily bread demands that we think about what we can do to make God's kingdom a reality on earth. Now, I'm acutely aware that the idea that we each have responsibilities to and for each other is, in this particular moment, rather un-American. For so many people in our country, the idea of responsibility towards others violates individual liberty. It wasn't always that way. I suppose Kayla pointed out to me this week that her great-grandparents in a little community on the plains of Oklahoma would have found this nonsense. Of course we have responsibility to each other. That's how we survive. And we could take it back even further than that. If we could revisit our religious forebears, those Puritans 400 years ago in the place that came to be Massachusetts, and we asked them if they felt like they had some responsibility to each other, they would have looked at us as like we were crazy. Or I actually think more likely they would have looked at us and suspected that we were possessed of the devil. For them, the highest human value was the good of the community. And the thing to be most feared among human beings was an overweening temptation to set oneself apart. That was the destroyer of communities. In other words, they feared any movement towards individualism. Now, if I'm being honest, I got to tell you, we would really hate living with them. They tirelessly scrutinized each other's behavior. They patrolled the boundaries of acceptable behavior with a fervor that denied the possibility of any individual privacy. They sought quite deliberately, and this will make you cringe, to break the will of toddlers. Well, I mean, you can sort of get it. Toddlers are natural anarchists. The Puritans absolutely abhorred any sign of that. For them, the point was that each person wasn't really unique, but each person had multiple roles that they were destined to play in the community, and that was that person's purpose. That was their identity. Everything would be just fine if everyone just played their assigned part. To set oneself apart as a distinct individual with distinct needs apart from everyone else was considered a travesty. There's a plus side. They took their responsibility to each other very, very seriously. I kept thinking this week about this Puritan court case that I used to teach. A young servant girl was tried for theft. She had stolen bread and apples from her mistress, who was from a high status family. Now, she was punished, of course. Stealing was stealing. But the telling part of this story is that her mistress was punished as well. The court declared that the mistress knew that her servant lived with her widowed mother in desperate circumstances, and the mistress had a duty to see that they were fed. Period. She'd been in the wrong. She was punished. Community members did not have what we think of as individual rights, but they most certainly had well-defined responsibilities towards each other. There was always an us. Now, obviously, the Puritans could not and did not make their idea of the perfect society endure, or we wouldn't be here like this. If you lived on a continent that was vast and you viewed the natives there as conveniently expendable, then you could escape the boundaries of community and seek your own fortune, your own goals, on your own terms. Individualism won. The Puritans were right about this, at least. Individualism does, in fact, unravel community. And we live 4 centuries after that unraveling began. So, in this moment in America, the idea that there's an us to which each of us has responsibilities is frankly a pretty tough sell. I don't mean a tough sell to you in this room. I don't mean a tough sell to a lot of our fellow citizens. But we are all aware that in the world in which we live right now, there are more than a few of our leaders and fellow citizens saying that individual freedom is the highest good, absolutely, and that the purest definition of freedom is that each of us should get to do exactly what we want without any regard for its effect on anyone else. Otherwise, they say, liberty dies. In this context, the Lord's Prayer is revealed to us as a profoundly countercultural prayer. In every part of it, it asks us to place ourselves in community with others and work towards the day when God's instructions are the instructions of the world, to set ourselves apart. And that is freedom as God defines it. 15 years ago, my youngest daughter, Carson, moved to England. In that first year, she was at loose ends on Christmas and decided that she would go to the midnight service at Westminster Abbey. And I confess I was extremely unhappy about this because the buses and subways shut down early on Christmas Eve. So she would be walking the 3 miles back to her tiny apartment by herself at 1:30 in the morning. With the impeccable logic of a young person, she said, "Mom, it's Christmas. There's no need to worry." But in the end, I got lucky. I did walk her home. As she walked, she called me and we talked for the whole route, which someplace in my heart convinced me that I was keeping her safe. She had found the service, that Christmas Eve service, in her words, beautiful, absolutely amazing. And so I said, "Well, what was the best part?" And she said, "Being with so many people, packed into the Abbey, standing shoulder to shoulder." And then she paused and added, "The very best thing was when we said the Lord's Prayer." Every person was saying it quietly, but there were so many of us, and the sound seemed to hum clear up to the ceiling. And around me, she said, I could hear maybe 6 or 7 different languages being spoken, but all of us in the same cadence, all of us together. Yeah, I know. This isn't my memory at all. But in less than a week after that, I stood in Westminster Abbey myself, this grand space that is part cathedral and part mausoleum. You can't walk 2 feet without running into a dead king. And I stood where my daughter had been standing, on Charles Darwin's grave, as it turns out. And I could not help but imagine the moment she had described. It just became so vivid to me looking up at those high ceilings. And I need to tell you something true. Sometimes when I'm saying the prayer of the Lord together with all of you in this sanctuary, I think of all those languages, all those cultures represented by the people in the Abbey on Christmas Eve 15 years ago. And then I think of all the voices that have said this prayer for 2 millennia in places across the globe. And then I am particularly grateful for the sound of all of us together, this we, this us, this community of faith praying that God's kingdom will come, praying that the needs of all of us will be met. My friends, let it be that we together may, in word and deed, always be praying God's kingdom comes, and always be praying, always, that we can be part of that coming. Amen.